So I've done this enough times. We got
like she says, it's not your first rodeo.
Nope, not my first rodeo. So thank you guys all for sticking around or coming out. So what we're going to talk about today is the exercise around injuries. I've been in the fitness world for 20-something years now, and working around people with injuries is just kind of something. It's an everyday thing now. Happens more times than not. And it could be something, whether it's like, sometimes it's stuff that pops up out of nowhere, sometimes it's stuff that's been 10 years in the making, sometimes it's stuff from an old high school injury. I mean, it's, you see everything imaginable. And so, over the years, we've really figured out some different strategies to really help people work around injuries. There is no, there is no one-size-fits-all solution, but, generally my belief is that most things get better if we get stronger. So our job from a fitness side of things is to help people get stronger without doing any harm to whatever the affected area may be. There's definitely a place where medical professionals come into this, whether it's physical therapists, chiropractors. But again, our job is like, okay, well, how can we help this person continue to stay active? Because there's a lot more to it than just the affected area. It's like, we've got to talk about the impact on like forming habits and routines, and if someone's got a shoulder injury, like, yeah, we might need to avoid working on that shoulder, but in my opinion, it's extremely important because forming habits is so difficult that if someone's finally, after 10 years of not working out, gotten into that routine of exercise, it's our job to try to keep them going any way possible, again, without messing up the shoulder. So what we're going to talk about real quick is just some injury myths and mistakes, some like principles of programming and how we work around injuries, and then like steps to take when recovering from injuries, and then just also like some preventative measures. So just so you know, I will email you kind of a recap of all this. I'll send you a link with the video as well, or something that you're like, I don't know what you said about this. And I'm also going to include on the back, you see a list of different exercises that can help with a lot of those areas. I will send you links with videos demonstrating all those as well. So that way you can, you can have them to reference anytime you want. So to start off really with the injury myths and mistakes, there's really three things that I feel like tend to come up over time. And the first one is just this idea that like, oh, you just need to rest. You just need to rest. And rest definitely has its place. And again, there may be times where we need to avoid work in that area. A lot of times rest alone isn't going to be the solution, because the biggest indicator of future injury is previous injury. So if something's, if you had an injury before, oftentimes just letting it rest is almost like putting a Band-Aid approach. It's like putting a Band-Aid on it. It's like, yeah, the inflammation might go down, it might feel better temporarily, but as soon as you go back to doing the things you were doing prior, oftentimes that injury is going to pop back up. So you need to think about, what is the real solution, whether, again, it's seeing a medical professional or doing strength training or some sort of rehab or some combination of things to help get to the real root of the problem, as opposed to just like, oh, I took a week off, now I feel better, I'm going to go right back to it. Because again, oftentimes it seems like the problem's going to come right back because we haven't really figured out what's going on. One of the other things that we look at is that the point of pain is often not the problem. So if you think about, when I think about the body, I think of it as just like kind of almost like a series of joints stacked on top of one another. And so oftentimes if you feel, just the simplest example is if someone feels pain in their low back, it could be a problem with the low back, but it could be something going on with the hips or the upper back, because everything kind of functions together. So just because you're experiencing pain in one specific area, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the problem or that's the weak link. Again, because everything's kind of interconnected and everything, it's one system that kind of all works together. So if there's a problem in one place, again, it may cause a problem somewhere up or down the chain. So that's how you have to look at this as far as, again, what's going on somewhere. It could be a problem, but it could be something generally above or below that area. That's kind of the root of the problem. And then the last thing around injuries is something that I refer to as like a light switch versus a dimmer switch. And this kind of goes to rest, but it really kind of encompasses everything. It's this idea that most people tend to think of injuries as a light switch, like it's, oh, I can't work out, or oh, I can't do anything with this. My favorite that drives me nuts is someone will say, oh, my doctor told me not to squat. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. So you can't go to the bathroom? Because that is a squat. So it's less about like, can I, again, it's less of a light switch and more of a dimmer switch. It's like, you could squat, but probably just not with extra weight, doing it through a like extreme range of motion. Again, everything falls on a continuum. And I think one of the common mistakes people make is just like, they look at it as like an all or none. And it's like, really, there's everything falls on a continuum, and there's different levels that you may need to modify based on your problem or whatever it is that's going on. So, as far as like the principles around programming around injuries and like what we look at here in the gym, how do we help someone work around injuries? And I'll just the challenge with this topic is there's a million different scenarios and there's no one size fits all. Everyone's situation is a little different, so there's always going to be an exception to the rule. But just to try to keep it simple, so we're not here till midnight. A couple of the things that we think about is how can we help someone work out around injuries. One idea would be to adjust what we call the acute training variables. And so what that would mean is just to make up a scenario. If someone has a wrist issue or issues where they can't grip a lot of weight, so they might not be able to grip a lot of weight. So if we were doing like the cable rows right here, it might not be challenging enough because the grip is a limiting factor. So how can we increase the challenge without having to increase the load on here? There's a couple different things we could look at. One would be to put someone in a less stable position. So for instance, instead of, if it's like, well, this isn't challenging enough, instead we could switch it out to where maybe we have them do an exercise on one leg. So now it's more challenging because they're on one leg, so it's going to increase the difficulty of the exercise without increasing the load on the hand or the wrist. Another solution, or another potential solution to that, would be to adjust the tempo. So if we want to if someone's saying, hey, you know what, I went to my doctor, chiropractor, physical therapist, and they don't want me using any more than 20 pounds, okay, that's, we can work with that. And if it was like, okay, they don't want me using any more than 20 pounds, one way we could adjust it to continue to make it more challenging while still limiting the individual to 20 pounds would be to adjust the tempo. So if you were doing a squat with 20 pounds, this might be really easy. But if we had you use that same 20 pounds, but really focus on going down really slow and control, that's going to increase the challenge without having to increase the load. So it's a way, again, if there's something to where it's like, for whatever reason, we can't use beyond X amount of weight, there's other variables that we can adjust to make it more challenging, whether it be to to change the tempo, to add some sort of hold, like at the bottom of the squat, for example, or we can adjust also like the range of motion. Like a good example, again, going back to that squat, would be to where we could have someone squat all the way down and then only come up 3/4 of the way. Not come up all the way because that's where the quadricep muscles get to relax. So we could come up we could change the range of motion to keep tension on the muscles longer, which again would increase the demand without having to increase the load. So those are the types of things, making something more stable, making something more or less stable, changing the range of motion, changing the tempo. Those are all things that we could do to take a specific exercise and make it more challenging without having to increase the resistance. If that's something that, again, we're trying to work within certain parameters, because we're not supposed to use more than, again, X amount of weight or whatever that may be. One of the other things that we look at, and this is why I'm a big advocate for, even if there is something going on, you should still do your best to stay active, and that's the contralateral strength training effect. The first study done on this was actually in Yale in, I think it was 1894, and it was, they looked at, it was a female that they were looking at her grip strength. She had a problem with one hand, and they had her like squeezing like a stress ball with her opposite hand. And what they found was that even though the hand that didn't, they didn't work it at all, by working on her grip strength in the opposite hand, there was kind of a transfer effect that helped increase the strength in the opposite hand. Now, it obviously wasn't the same, but the same thing applies to arms, legs, and all the, you know, and all the other fun stuff. When you're working one area, there is a transfer effect of the on the other side. I've looked into this a ton over the years, and it's interesting. There's really, I cannot find a consensus on why doctors agree, like across the board, like how this happens, but everyone does seem to agree that it does happen. Again, why it happens, I think the human bodies, personally, I believe it's, there's so much about it we still don't understand or know, and I think this is one of those things that like we don't truly understand, but it clearly happens and works. So again, there's benefits to working on the opposite limb because that will help you maintain strength on the injured side that you, even though you're not necessarily directly working that muscle. The next piece of this is something I refer to as the joint-by-joint approach. And so this comes from a couple people much smarter than myself. But it's basically the idea that this kind of goes back to the problem is often due to maybe something above or below the point of pain. So again, if you have pain in your hip, it could be because something's going on actually with your low back or your knee. A lot of people have low back pain, very common, we see it all the time, and it actually doesn't really have much to do with the back as much as like maybe the hips aren't functioning properly. And so when we look at the joint-by-joint approach, it's basically this idea that the body is a series of stackable joints of alternating needs. And what that means is, so our ankle, if we start at the bottom here, our ankle typically needs to be more mobile. So what that meaning like our ankle typically needs to be able to move around more than it can. A lot of times due to the heels that are either whether it's high heels or just even like heel lifts and tennis shoes, we tend to lose dorsiflexion over time, meaning our knees can't come forward here because of our ankles. It's like we just get stuck. And so that affects our ability to squat. So generally our ankles need to be more mobile than what they are. Moving on up the chain here, then we get to our knees, and our knees typically need to be more stable. We don't want them moving all over the place. That's not going to end well typically. So our knees generally need to be more stable. If we continue on up the chain, then our hips need to be more mobile. And if you think about from all the time we spend sitting, our hips are in a short position, everything tightens up. So again, I think that's one of the things that keeps people like Toby in business is the fact that people sit so much, and then that leads, and because hips tighten up, that ends up leading to back pain and a ton of other issues. But the hips need to be more mobile, and then the low back, a lot of people, when you look at your spine, our lumbar spine is not really meant to move around a ton. So our upper back, that's a little different story. But as far as our lumbar spine, it's really not meant to rotate hardly at all. And so if you think about when their hips are tight and their upper back's tight, again, from them sitting all day, those two areas tighten up. What happens is because we can't rotate how we're supposed to, or because we can't move how we're supposed to, we end up forcing that movement through the low back, which is generally not a good thing over time. So again, just looking at this joint-by-joint approach, it just speaks to why a lot of what we work on, you can't just think about like, oh, my knees hurt, I need to worry about my knees. It's like, yeah, maybe, but there's a good chance we also need to look at your hip mobility or your ankle mobility. And again, it's just because, and that's just how it works throughout the entire body, is that there's an alternating series of needs where areas need to be more stable and areas need to be more mobile. So that's, again, so it just really stresses to reemphasize the take-home message is just that, what's going on, wherever you're experiencing pain or discomfort, there's other things that could be going on around that could have an impact on helping, working on those other areas may help you feel better. Now, where we look at, again, the last principle that we're looking at is where to add in work for these specific areas. If we think about, well, when's the best block? The question I often get is like, when's the best time to work on, stretching my hips out or my shoulders or whatever the case may be? And my answer is always like, just whenever you do it. Sometimes we'll spring a lot of this stuff. We do things and we don't always, just because most people don't care and they fall asleep if we went down a rabbit hole, but we do a lot of this stuff like during our warm-up. We'll work on the shoulders, the hips, and we do a lot of things like that in our warm-up to work some of those areas. We sometimes will sprinkle it in throughout the workout, depending on the client's goals and their needs and just personal preferences. Sometimes, we can do it at the end of the workout. Sometimes it would be like, hey, if you're willing, if you're going to do this, you can do it at home, morning, night, it doesn't matter. This is where you kind of have to, know yourself and know what's going to work for you. For example, myself, like personally, I'll stretch out first thing in the morning, but there's no chance in the world you will find me stretching at night in the evening. I just won't do it at the end of the day. And so again, it's just kind of like you've just got to know yourself and know like, all right, when is the best time for me to do this, or when will I actually do this? Because at the end of the day, it's like that should be kind of, in my opinion, priority number one. Just when will you do it? And you've got to do what works for you. So, and everyone's going to be a little bit different. So those are the things, like I said, focus less on like the perfect timing and more just on execution. When will you actually incorporate the things that we need to work on? Moving right down here, when we look at like steps to take when recovering from an injury, the first thing, and this is kind of like our priority number one, it's do no harm. Again, as I mentioned, when we first started, I'm a big advocate of, even when someone's hurt, like you've got to keep working out. You got to do your best to stay active. Sure, there's always exceptions to the rule. There's always times where like, okay, I've got to wait, X period of time. But we want to do everything we can to keep someone active because there's so much more than just the shoulder or the knee or that one thing. It's their habits and routines. It's, if we think about the benefits on mental health and exercise, like there's more and more research coming out there, just from building up strength in other areas, from heart health standpoint. So again, if we're nursing an injury, we've got to keep in mind, that when it comes to the benefits of exercise, there's a lot of other stuff going on besides that one joint or area. And so, and on top of that, again, we've got to think about doing everything we can just to stay in the routine. Big believer in that. One of the most important pieces is just getting into a routine, so it's something that you can sustain, because at the end of the day, like it or not, exercise is something we have to do for the rest of our lives. Like there's no end. And like I said, it's just the way it is. It's something that, it's just that important. For us, again, it goes back to, step one is do no harm. So depending on the situation, if we're talking about someone with a shoulder injury or shoulder discomfort, that may mean we don't do anything with the shoulder at all whatsoever. That would be kind of on the low or the extreme end. On the other end of things, it could be, we can still do push-ups, we can still do some pressing, but maybe we just don't do any sort of like overhead pressing, because that's going to stress the shoulder the most. Again, everything exercise falls on a continuum, so that's a conversation that it would have to be had kind of one-on-one to figure out what is that appropriate level for each individual. Because again, we don't want to make anything worse, but we do want to help someone, get strong as best we can. And so again, it's going to fall on that continuum somewhere, and it's going to be a little bit different for each person. The next step to think about when returning from an injury, and this applies both in the gym and outside of the gym, is that I would suggest adjusting variables slowly and one to two things at a time. This really applies to anything, not just injuries. I would say the same thing if someone's trying to lose body fat. Only change one or two things at a time. Again, whether we're talking about trying to decrease body fat, or when it comes to working around injuries, you only want to change one or two variables at a time. That way, you know what works and what doesn't work. If you change, again, if you want to look at it totally different, if you if you're trying to lose body fat and you change 10 different things in your routine and you see success, that's awesome. But then it's like, well, what actually worked? Then it's hard to know, like, well, what do I need to focus on long term? Do I still need to focus on all 10 things? That sounds very exhausting. You know, it's better if you change 1 or 2 things at a time so that you can figure out, like, what are those key ingredients that are going to give you the greatest bang for your buck. Same thing with injuries. Coming back from them or working around them, I would suggest you only want to change a couple things at a time. That way, if there is any sort of discomfort after the fact, if you're like, you know what, John, man, I've been feeling pretty good, but yesterday after my workout, like something just didn't feel right. It's easier to go back and see, like, okay, well, we only changed these 2 things, so it probably was one of those 2 things. So again, this applies to both inside and outside of the gym. If you're coming back from an injury, I wouldn't suggest coming in and working out and then going like shoveling rock for 4 hours. Because if something causes a problem afterwards, it's like, well, what was it? Was it the workout? Was it shoveling rock? Was it something else? So when you're coming back, when you're doing something, I would just strongly advise, like, you want to change, the fewer variables you change, the better, just because that will give you more feedback on, is this okay, or do I need to make other adjustments or modifications, so that again, it helps you just know what's working, what maybe, do we need to change, or what isn't working. So, and then the last thing would be looking at again, going back to that like dimmer switch versus light switch. My favorite, and I say that sarcastically, my favorite comment or conversation is, and I'll be the first to admit, runners are the absolute worst, is when I'm talking to someone that's a runner, they're coming back from an injury, and they're like, yeah, I felt pretty good, my doctor released me, so I ran 7 miles yesterday. And I'm like, 7, and then they're going from 0 to 7. And I'm like, man, which for a lot of runners, that's just their normal routine. I think there's nothing normal about that, but some people do. But it's just, it's this idea of like going right back to what they were doing prior, as opposed to like, how about starting with like 1 mile, and then 2, and then 3, and you'll get back to 7, but it's probably not a good idea to go back there tomorrow. So again, I pick on runners for that example, but it applies to the gym, it applies to everything else. When you're coming back from an injury, you want to do so slow. You want it to take more of a gradual approach. An example that I dealt with a stress fracture last year. I hurt my foot hiking, and when I got out of my boot and started walking again, and I usually walk the dog every morning. What I did was I would set an alarm on my phone, and I think it was like 7 minutes at first. And so I walked down the street, and as soon as that alarm went off 7 minutes, I turned around and went back. The dog was really mad at me because it wasn't long enough. But that was the way. And then like the next day it was 8 minutes, and we walked 8 minutes, and then we turned around. And the next day it was 9, and then 10. And so we got back to, she finally stopped getting mad at me once we got back to our normal like 2.5 mile walk, but it was over a period of like 2 weeks. And so it was just, again, I set an alarm, and as soon as the alarm went off, even whether I wanted to or not, she definitely didn't want to, we turned around and went back. But it was, again, it's that like dimmer switches. When when you're ramping back up, you want to do so slow and steady, just because, again, it gives the body a chance to kind of get back into the groove of things. So, when you're thinking about coming back from injuries, again, think about like, it's nothing. There's nothing. It should be an all or none. It should be an all or none. It should be a gradual approach. So if you flip back over and look on the back side here, and again, this is difficult to do because there's a million exceptions to the rule, and I could have thought of like 100 other scenarios, but I really wanted to try to keep it relatively simple. These are, in my opinion, some of the bigger things that can help someone out, or that they should consider looking at, or the areas that I would start with. Again, there's always going to be 10 different scenarios or 10 different examples, but when we look at kind of the 3 most common areas of pain or discomfort are the back, knees, and shoulders. So when we're talking about the back specifically, the movements that you you want to consider avoiding if you have back pain would be like heavy hinging type movements. So that might be like a kettlebell swing where you're grabbing a kettlebell and swinging it up explosively in front of you, something like that. Or what we call like a straight leg deadlift where you're holding a weight and then just bending over with your legs straight. Again, for some people that's fine, but it just more times than not, if someone has a back issue, those are things that some of the first things that I would look at, maybe scrapping or making adjustments for. And then the next two would be running. So as you can tell, I'm not a big proponent of running. And the reason I say that is just because the amount of force that our body has to absorb. If you think about an example, I heard years ago was like, if I told you, I want you to stand on, you come in for your workout on Monday and I'm here and I say, all right, here's the deal. I want you to stand on your right leg. I just want you to jump 1,000 times. Right? Just jump 1,000 times. And then do it on your left leg 1,000 times. You'd probably be like, man, John, that's probably overdoing it, right? Isn't that a little excessive? Most people would probably think that. But if you jumped on one leg and then on the other, we call that running. And so, again, running it's a lot of stress on the body. So some people can do it forever and they'll be fine. I have plenty of friends like that, but most people generally, it's a lot of stress on the body. And then heavy rotational movements are the last kind of thing that I would look at modifying around some of the back injuries. Now, when I say that, I mean like we do a lot of different. We do a lot of core movements where we're moving around a little bit here, and that's one thing. When I talk about rotational movements, I mean people that have back issues, we wouldn't maybe want to do something excessive where we're here and we're turning all the way around. So again, it's within, there's different, well, how much rotation is too much? That depends on each individual. But, there's a difference between just kind of moving a little bit through and even moving more through the hips and like doing a full-on twisting motion, moving 180 degrees, moving a weight 180 degrees. So those are the type of things specific to back injuries that I would generally steer away from, or just find maybe a different alternative. So looking at the knee issue, looking at knee pain, the three things are jumping, running, and forward type lunges. So again, there's other, for some people, those would be fine. This is, this is just to kind of look at things, through a broad lens. Sometimes we have to take it a little bit step further. Maybe, so again, when we're looking at lunge variations, lunging forward is generally going to be the most stressful on the knees. Some people, lunging forward might bother them, but lunging backwards is totally fine. And then there's other people that lunging forward or backwards is going to be problematic. Again, it's just, everyone's body is going to be a little bit different. So, but those are the three different things that I would look to avoid, specifically with knee issues. And then the last category with shoulder issues, first thing that we would rule out would be overhead pressing. So, and that would be, a lot of times I'm just grabbing a dumbbell, pressing overhead. Again, some people might be fine, but if someone's got relatively severe shoulder issues, that's probably the first thing that we're going to scrap. We're just removing. We'll find ways to substitute. So, because there's multiple ways to work different muscles. So, the overhead pressing will be the first one. The second one will be pressing through a fixed plane of motion. We don't really do that here, so it's not an issue. But when I think about that, think of like a lot of gyms where you go to and you're sitting on like a machine and pressing something straight out, where the reason that I think that doesn't work for a lot of people is because you're having to go through a fixed plane of motion. You can't really make a lot of adjustments, whereas if you're doing something with like a T-Rex push-up, for instance, you've got a lot more control here. You can move the hands in, out, up, down. You can find a pattern that feels a lot more comfortable for you. Whereas again, if you're on a machine, you can't make those adjustments because you're going out one angle to push. However, the machine is fixed or designed. So again, with something like that, you've got a lot more flexibility in how you press up. Same thing for people that have shoulder issues. When we do, probably the thing that feels the most comfortable would be doing with these cable machines where we press straight out. That's one that, again, because you can control the range of motion, move your hand up, down, out, in. You've got a lot. You can find kind of a movement that works for you. And then the last type of exercise that we might adjust would be our single arm core exercises. Think of like getting in a push-up position and then putting all your weight on one hand. So for someone that has some sort of shoulder problem, it's probably not the first place I would start. But we've got other substitutions that would work well. So again, so to kind of wrap this up, in this topic's like it's challenging because there's so many variables to take into account, and there's so many circumstances that are specific to each individual. But the underlying message that I really try to preach to people, and the big takeaways are really to, if you're dealing with an injury or if you've dealt with one and you don't want to deal with it again, the big things to think about are this idea of like a light switch versus a dimmer switch. If something's bothering you, back off a little bit. Don't look at it as like, oh, I can't squat anymore. Again, like I said, so you can't go to the bathroom. Like you've got to find, think of exercise as it falls on a continuum, and we may have to back off, and we can definitely help make those adjustments. But I don't ever want anyone to think like, oh, I can't work out at all. There's nothing I can do, because again, there's so many more benefits from a mental health standpoint, from a cardiovascular health standpoint, from a strengthening the other areas of the body, to the benefits of just being in forming healthy habits and routines. Exercising is something that I believe strongly in. And to kind of wrap this up, the reason this topic is so important to me is because I've been in the fitness industry now, I think coming up on 22 years, and I started exercising long before that, and I've nagged my father for about 30 years about working out. Nagging is the appropriate term to use. So I've nagged him for 30 years to work out. And every time, once this happens, once that happens, oh, my arthritis is back, my shoulders bother me, my feet bother me, there's always something. And he never started. And he's still alive. He's 75 years old. He's never been able to pick up his grandson, who's 3, awesome kid. Loves tow trucks. My dad can't get on the ground and tow trucks with him. Can't pick up his granddaughter, and he was just born 7 months ago. He can't, go play with his, like I said, he can't play with his grandkids. My dad loves hunting and fishing. He hasn't been able to do either one of those for a decade because he doesn't have the strength. So this is a topic that is extremely important to me because I live every day with seeing what happens when you don't take care of yourself. And I get it, it's not easy exercising. I'll be the first to admit exercising in a lot of ways sucks. Because you stink, it takes time, you don't see results. Eating ice cream is a lot more enjoyable as far as I'm concerned. But you can't, but at the same time, I say that pretty serious, but at the same time, like the impact of not exercising, the cost of inaction is something that, like I said, I see every day firsthand in my immediate family. And I don't want anyone to deal with that. From seeing my dad not be able to play with his grandkids, he's had probably half a dozen strokes, maybe more. I'm not even sure. Like we stopped counting. My brother and I did, just like, oh, Dad's back in the hospital. It's just kind of the normal. And like I said, it's something that I don't want anyone to live with. So, if you're thinking about like, I don't know, if anyone's having any hesitation, I hope maybe I've guilted you at least a little bit into, if you're not going to do it for yourself, do it for the people that matter in your life. Your spouse, your kids, your grandkids, do it for them. So, thank you all. I appreciate you guys sticking around. I appreciate your time. It means the world to me. And if you have any questions, I'm here. Fire away.